Dickson, as you think about kind of PayFac and where they're at, right, in any evolution, like when's the right time as an organization to start thinking about your exit?
Oh boy, it's a great question. I think I would pose that to any founder. You need to ask that question the day you're forming a company, and I think you need to ask yourself two questions. Are you creating a company to run, or are you creating a company to sell? And I think the direction and how you manage and how you grow that business really matters. And so I'm not sure there's ever a perfect time for an exit, but I think, even from inception, you have to kind of think about your exit, or if that's your intention.
What are the metrics that investors looking at in a PayFac, and what are you evaluating maybe highest priority? And then what's the flip side? What are some of those red flags that might scare an investor off from a PayFac type of investment?
Yeah. So when we look at metrics, bluntly, it's a business like any other, and we typically start with financial metrics. And in fact, one way to think about it is any transaction processing business, certainly PayFacs, other types of payments companies, you can think of as almost, I totally understand it's not exactly right, but in many ways analogous to SaaS businesses. And the reason I'm pointing you that direction, there's been a ton published about what the right metrics are to look at in SaaS businesses. So yeah, you look at run rate revenues, and of course in PayFac you want to look at nets, because no one wants to talk about gross, right? But then you look at things like growth, and you look at churn, and you look at how those two add together to kind of net new add, and you take the SaaS concepts and move them over into the appropriate payment words, and it really does not require a lot of translation. We do care about burn. Not saying that companies have to be profitable, but we care about it. We want to make sure that the investments that are being made, are contributing to the growth in a nice, positive ROI sort of way. But the metrics are pretty straightforward.
As you mentioned, a number of the SaaS metrics apply. It's a great way to think about it because there's a lot of content out there. I'll throw one out. It's probably not a new idea for most folks, especially if the ISVs, but rule of 40. So you just add the revenue plus the EBITDA margin, and if it's more than 40, you're doing well, and if it's less than 40, it might have some work to do. So simple things like that. Of course, churn factors in, critical component, and then certain industries.
One of the things when we've looked at or been involved in roll-ups in the payment space is kind of something Dickson was talking about. You're looking at what's going on in the underlying book. How much growth are you getting without? Because the reality is you typically will pay for whatever there, especially in some of these markets where there are one or two big roll-ups going on. There becomes a kind of relatively well-known set of metrics around which they're valued. And so the question is, what do you know about how that business is going to grow following the acquisition? And so, I think it's important to kind of think about that. I think for a PayFac or an ISV that's thinking about selling into one of these things, I think it's also important to think about kind of all the emotional issues around how attached one is to the business. And then also, finally, typically, the head or the senior management team has put a lot on the line in selling those customers, those merchants in the first place, and getting them to come on to their platform. And then when they sell out, on one hand, you get all the benefits of being attached to a larger platform and having a thoughtful strategy around how you're attacking payments as a whole. On the other hand, that particular management team, that particular entrepreneur loses control of that relationship and has to be willing to give up on that. At times, decisions are made that may not be to the benefit of that individual customer, and sometimes, again, there's a sort of personal bond around there. So it is a whole set of trade-offs, falling generally into that. What are you giving up? And then, in terms of running it the right way, is what level of control to exert on the newly acquired entities. Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to go back to tried and true. If payments consolidation is baseball, what inning are we in, and why? And then what do you think is going to happen with multiples? Increase, decrease, going to stay the same? And so Eric, we'll start with you.
So what I'd say about consolidation is consolidation comes and goes in waves. And actually, for all of us payment folks, I'd remind us that we've had multiple waves of ISO consolidation over the years. So now we're talking about PayFacs and ISVs, but we have seen this kind of front end of the payments pie consolidating, being pulled together by private equity. There's a period where it doesn't happen as much. It happens again, and then it doesn't happen. I mean, we've seen this several times. So I'm going to argue it's not a game of baseball because it keeps recurring over and over and over again. It's like the chess tournament where you just keep going and going and going and going every weekend. So, you know, we're in this particular cycle, to not entirely duck your question, I think in this particular one we're maybe halfway through. I don't think we're particularly at the beginning or particularly at the end. But I think even after this one ends, give it 3 to 5 years of fallowness, and then it'll happen again.
Paul?
Want to go first? Yeah,
No, go ahead.
I mean, I would say it's half to a third makes sense to me, and I completely agree with what you were saying about in terms of the cycle continuing. I do think it is industry specific and subsector, so there can be little ISVs, so faith-based organizations. Is there more to do there or not? So there is some specific to where your individual ISV or what industries you're serving. Some are wide open, so gaming, esports, things like that might be more wide open than other areas. Other folks have mentioned international as an opportunity. Perhaps some people aren't even taking payments in certain international areas just because it's too difficult right now. So certain areas are different. There is a lot of this is certainly fueled by debt markets. So if there were interest rates were to rise by 3 or 4%, that might put just like the housing prices change. If your interest payment doubles, it could change things. So, but right now that looks like it's staying flat or going down. So it certainly seems like a lot of room to go.
I may get this wrong, but I think there are 162 games in a season, right? So I think we're about midway through the season in terms of an inning. You know, there's been a pause, but now it's started up again. So I think it's people sort of did their 7th inning stretch, and now there's been a recent rash of very big acquisitions. I think there's a few more, and then based on available capital and the capital markets. Most economists will say there'll probably be, let's say, a small to a 1 sigma recession next year, which says there will be a little contraction in the capital markets. It'll slow down, but as long as you're doing something that is needed everywhere, and by the way, it's also geographic, right? Whether you're talking about the U.S. I mean, I said in the earlier session about India. I mean, talk about the Wild West, so. There are still really early stage markets. I mean, the world's just starting to get digital, right? I mean, according to McKinsey, I think we're still at something like 68% of all the world's money is still in cash of transactions. And so as that marches along, we've got a long ways to go.